The delicate glass ornament shivered on the lowest branch of the Christmas tree, reflecting the cold twinkle of silver and blue fairy lights. Outside, a heavy, silent blanket of snow choked the midnight streets of Vermont. Inside the living room of my childhood home, the atmosphere was completely frozen. A single piece of heavy white paper rested on the mahogany coffee table, its black ink stark and definitive under the warm holiday lamps. "We signed the final deed transfer an hour ago, Owen," my mother said, her voice smooth and entirely devoid of hesitation as she took a slow sip of her eggnog. "Your brother needs this property to secure his architectural firm's credit line. You've had a comfortable apartment downtown for years. It's time to be practical." I looked down at the signature line. There it was. My parents' names written in elegant, flowing script, sitting directly next to my younger brother's aggressive, heavy-handed signature. They had just given away the historic colonial estate that my grandfather had built with his own hands. They had given away the house where I had spent 32 years making memories, the house I had single-handedly maintained while Julian was traveling across Europe on our family's dime. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sickening mixture of blinding betrayal and absolute shock suffocating me. For my entire life, I had been the invisible pillar holding this family together. But as my mother looked at me with cold, dismissive eyes on Christmas Eve, I realized I was completely done playing the victim. They thought they had backed me into a corner while the holiday offices were closed. They had absolutely no idea that upstairs, buried inside the iron walls of Grandpa's hidden floor safe, lay a single, certified legal document containing one last definitive signature that would completely dismantle their little real estate scheme before the snow melted on Christmas morning. I am currently standing in the narrow hallway upstairs, leaning my forehead against the cool, dark wallpaper of my grandfather's old library. Downstairs, the muffled sounds of a celebratory toast echo through the floorboards. I can hear the high-pitched clinking of crystal glasses and Julian's loud, arrogant laughter boisterously vibrating through the house. He is already talking about which walls he's going to knock down to turn our family's historic parlor into a modern, minimalist home office. The immediate conflict centers around this exact house, a beautiful 5-bedroom historical estate valued at roughly $1.8 million, sitting on 12 pristine acres of old-growth timberland. When my grandfather, Silas Thorne, passed away 2 years ago, he left the property under the executive management of my parents, assuming they would preserve it as a multi-generational sanctuary for our entire family. Instead, my mother, Evelyn, and my father, Arthur, began treating the estate like their personal financial safety net. Julian's high-end architectural firm had been hemorrhaging cash due to bad commercial investments in the city, and my parents had quietly decided that the best way to save their golden child was to liquidate my heritage. They had arranged the entire deed transfer in absolute secrecy, choosing Christmas Eve specifically because they knew my legal team would be completely unreachable until after the holidays. "Julian has a grand vision for the Thorne name, Owen," my father had told me earlier, without even looking me in the eye as he adjusted his silk holiday tie. "You're just a local land surveyor. You don't need a historic landmark to do your job. Be a team player for once." The sheer injustice of it makes my hands shake. I was the son who stayed behind. When Grandpa Silas was suffering through the final agonizing stages of vascular dementia, Julian couldn't find the time to catch a flight home. I was the one who changed his linens, who sat with him through the terrifying mid-afternoon episodes of confusion, and who ran the property's drainage lines in the middle of freezing October rainstorms to keep the foundation from cracking. Now they're treating me like a temporary tenant who has overstayed his welcome. They believe because the active county property registry lists them as the primary executors, they have the unconstrained authority to sign this house away to Julian. But they made a massive, arrogant assumption about Grandpa's mental state during his final months. As I reach down and slide my fingers along the hidden seam of the baseboard beneath Grandpa's heavy mahogany desk, I feel the cold iron latch of his hidden floor safe. The power dynamic in this family is about to experience a catastrophic structural failure. To understand how a family could completely disregard their own flesh and blood on the night of Christmas Eve, you have to understand the specific weight of the Thorne family estate. The house was built in 1924 by my grandfather, Silas Thorne, who was a master stonemason and a deeply traditional man. Every single square inch of the property reflected his physical labor. The massive, hand-cut fieldstone fireplace in the great room still smelled faintly of wood smoke, old leather, and the crisp, clean scent of dry white pine that he used to stack in the wood box every winter. Grandpa Silas was a towering, quiet man who wore heavy wool shirts and possessed calluses so thick his hands felt like oak bark. He was a man of few words, but his actions were completely absolute. He believed that a home wasn't an asset to be leveraged on a corporate spreadsheet. It was an anchor designed to keep a family rooted to the earth. Owen, Grandpa Silas had told me when I was a 10-year-old boy, sitting beside him on the wide stone hearth as a massive, blustering blizzard rattled the heavy, double-paned windows. A real house isn't built out of drywall and nails. It's built out of promises. You see these stones? I pulled every single one of them out of the riverbed down the valley. Each one supports the other. If you remove just one foundational stone because you think it's convenient, the whole chimney will crack and crush you while you sleep. Remember who built this foundation. I took those words into my very soul. I became his permanent apprentice. While my younger brother, Julian, spent his childhood indoors playing complex city-building simulation games or traveling to expensive private tennis academies with my mother, I was outside with Grandpa. I learned how to mix mortar by feel, how to trace the natural underground springs that threatened our basement walls, and how to read the age of a cedar shingle just by running my thumb along its grain. My mother, Evelyn, was a woman completely obsessed with social standing and superficial elegance. She came from a family of metropolitan real estate brokers and viewed Grandpa's rugged, rustic lifestyle as an embarrassing stain on the Thorne family's potential social register. She adored Julian from the exact second he was born. He had her striking silver blonde hair, her sharp, calculating blue eyes, and an easy, superficial charm that could convince people to buy ice in the winter. I, on the other hand, inherited my grandfather's build: broad shoulders, dark hair, quiet brown eyes, and a total preference for the silence of the woods over the noise of my mother's country club charity auctions. My mother treated my quietness like a personal developmental defect, a genetic disappointment that she had to constantly manage and apologize for. Owen is just like my father, she would sigh dismissively to her friends over afternoon tea, while I was outside, covered in mud, helping Grandpa clear a fallen oak from the western fence line. He has no real ambition for high society. He's completely content living in the dirt. Despite the emotional distance from my parents, my childhood was profoundly beautiful because of Grandpa Silas and Grandma Clara. Grandma Clara was a gentle, warm presence who filled the historic kitchen with the rich, buttery aroma of fresh gingerbread and roasted cinnamon apples every December. Her kitchen was the literal heart of the mansion, a safe haven where the wood stove was always roaring and the copper pots gleamed under the soft yellow light. "Don't you ever feel small, Owen," Grandma Clara would whisper to me, gently pressing a warm, sugar-dusted cookie into my palms, after my mother had spent an entire dinner praising Julian's private school report cards. "Your brother knows how to draw pretty pictures of buildings on paper, but you are the one who knows how to keep this home alive. Your grandfather sees your heart, and so do I. Real strength doesn't need to shout to be noticed." I believed her with all my heart. For over 20 years, I used that warmth to protect myself from my mother's freezing indifference. When Grandma Clara passed away 12 years ago, the kitchen lost its vibrant light and the cinnamon smells slowly faded, replaced by the sterile, expensive French lavender oils my mother ordered the interior designers to place in every room. I clung even tighter to Grandpa Silas, dedicating my entire adulthood to maintaining his land, while Julian lived a lavish lifestyle in a city penthouse, sending his mounting credit card bills and business debts back home for my parents to quietly cover through family loans. I never questioned my position because I genuinely believed that my loyalty, my sweat, and my absolute dedication to preserving the Thorne homestead would eventually open my parents' eyes. I thought that if I sacrificed my personal relationships and spent my weekends repairing the historic slate roof, they would finally see me as a son worthy of respect. I didn't realize that my parents and Julian were looking at the house through a completely different lens, not as a sacred family trust, but as a multi-million-dollar life jacket designed to save the favorite son, no matter who they had to drown in the process. The first subtle warning signs began to surface about 3 years ago, right around the time Grandpa Silas began experiencing his first major lapses in short-term memory. Up until that point, he had handled all the property taxes, utility accounts, and land management documentation himself through his private bank account. But as his cognitive health began to noticeably decline, my mother immediately stepped in to assume control of his physical administrative files. I vividly remember coming into the house late one Tuesday evening in November to drop off a new set of topographic maps for the northern timber lot. The main floor was completely dark, but a sharp line of white light was cutting across the hardwood floor from Grandpa's private office. I walked down the hallway, my soft wool socks making no sound on the rug, and found my mother standing over the vintage roll-top desk. She was holding Grandpa's original handwritten estate ledger, systematically scanning the pages with her phone camera. "Mom, what are you doing with Grandpa's journals so late?" I asked, setting my maps down on the side table. She gasped loudly, her shoulders tensing instantly as she dropped her phone onto the desk. Her face, usually so perfectly composed and frozen with cosmetic elegance, looked startled and intensely guilty for a brief fraction of a second before her cold, defensive mask slid back into place. "It's nothing that concerns you, Owen," she snapped, her voice like a dry twig snapping in the quiet room as she quickly slid the ledger into her designer leather tote bag. "I'm simply archiving your grandfather's old business papers before his memory gets any worse. Go back out to your workshop. You smell like chainsaw exhaust and damp pine needles." I dismissed the interaction at the time, assuming she was just being her usual difficult, controlling self. But then the behavioral shifts within the family began to drastically accelerate. Whenever the family's longtime estate attorney, Mr. Abernathy, came to the house to discuss the long-term management of the Thorne property, my mother would suddenly find an urgent, elaborate errand to send me on the other side of the county. "Owen, we desperately need you to drive up to the northern nursery and check on the winter survival rates of the saplings today," she would tell me at breakfast, her voice dripping with an artificial, sickening maternal sweetness. "It's a critical task, and you're the only one with the technical expertise to handle it. Don't worry about the afternoon administrative meeting with the lawyer. It's just boring tax jargon anyway. We won't keep you from your work." The emotional imbalance in the house became completely suffocating. When Julian would come up from the city for the winter holidays, the entire household turned into a stage production dedicated to his comfort. My mother would host extravagant cocktail dinners for local property developers, introducing Julian as the brilliant architectural mind who represents the true future of the Thorne family legacy. "Julian has such a magnificent modern vision for design," she would loudly announce to her wealthy country club circle, while I stood near the kitchen door wearing my only formal blazer, which was visibly frayed at the pocket seams. "He's going to completely elevate our family's profile in the state." If any of our old neighbors asked about my extensive engineering work on the estate's historic stonework or drainage lines, my mother would wave her hand with complete indifference. "Oh, Owen just handles the outdoor chores. He's our practical boy."
Every property needs someone to clean the gutters and clear the roads, I suppose. I noticed that during these conversations, Grandpa Silas would often look at my mother with a strange, profound sadness and deep, silent suspicion. He would try to speak up, to remind everyone that I was the one keeping the roof over their heads, but my mother's dementia had made his speech slow and halting, and my mother would deftly interrupt him, steering the conversation back to Julian's superficial accolades before Grandpa could finish a single sentence. The financial neglect became targeted as well. When the historic stone retaining wall near the western barn began to bulge from water pressure, I asked my father for a modest $5,000 allocation from the estate account to purchase structural reinforcement steel and fresh lime mortar. He flatly denied the request, claiming the family fund was experiencing a major liquidity crisis due to low timber yields. Yet, less than 2 weeks later, I found a commercial bank receipt sitting in the office copier showing a $40,000 direct wire transfer to a luxury lifestyle marketing firm in New York, the exact firm Julian had hired to promote his failing architectural brand. Julian needs to maintain a premier market presence to attract high-net-worth clients, Owen, my father snapped when I confronted him with the paper. You live in the old caretaker cottage and spend your days in the woods. You don't have an image to maintain. Learn to see the bigger picture. I felt completely isolated, but I continuously convinced myself that as long as Grandpa Silas was alive, the true spirit of the home would be protected. I failed to see the legal net my parents and Julian were quietly weaving around me, using my own silent dedication to keep the estate pristine, while they systematically prepared to completely erase me from the place I called home. The conflict escalated into an absolute nightmare 2 months ago, during the final week of Grandpa Silas's life. He had been admitted to a specialized hospice care wing in Burlington, his physical frame shrinking down to almost nothing under the white hospital blankets. I had been awake for nearly 3 days straight, sitting in a plastic chair by his bedside, holding his cold, calloused hand while my parents and Julian were downtown staying at a luxury boutique hotel, claiming the hospital atmosphere was too emotionally exhausting for them to handle for long periods. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the heavy snow outside tapping against the glass, Grandpa Silas suddenly opened his eyes. The terrifying cloudiness of his dementia was completely gone, replaced by a sudden, fierce lucidity that absolutely shocked me. He squeezed my hand with an unbelievable amount of physical strength, his lips moving frantically as he pulled me down toward his chest. "Owen, the safe," he whispered, his breath smelling faintly of medicine and mint, his voice a raspy, desperate hum. "Under the desk, the baseboard. Don't let Evelyn see the final deed. I signed it with Abernathy. You protect the stones, Owen. Don't let them tear down what we built." He let out a long, ragged gasp, his chest rising sharply one last time, and then the heart monitor beside the bed began to emit a flat, continuous tone that shattered the silence of the room. I broke down completely, burying my face in his heavy wool blanket, weeping for the grandfather who had been the only real father I ever knew. Within 15 minutes, my parents and Julian walked into the room, looking perfectly rested and immaculate. There were no tears on my mother's face. She looked at the flat line on the monitor, then turned her gaze directly toward me with an intense, chilling relief that made my stomach turn. "It's a blessing it's finally over," she said coldly, not offering me a single hand of comfort or touching her father's body. She immediately turned to Julian. "Call the private estate handlers and make sure the locks on the main library desk are secured before morning. We need to consolidate all property files immediately." The very next afternoon, before Grandpa's body was even cold in the ground, the entire operational dynamic of the Thorne estate shifted with terrifying speed. I arrived at the main house to check on the winter heating oil levels, only to find 2 private security contractors standing on the stone porch. "We're sorry, Mr. Thorne," the taller guard said, looking genuinely uncomfortable as he stepped in front of the door. But Evelyn Thorne issued a temporary restriction order. No one is permitted inside the main residence until the formal probate assessment is completed. "I live on this property," I shouted, the cold winter air biting at my throat. "I have my tools in the basement. I manage the structural lines." "Your tools will be moved to the caretaker's cottage by the staff, Owen," my mother's voice called out as she stepped onto the porch, wrapped in an expensive mink coat. "During this transition, Julian needs absolute quiet in the main house to finalize his company's restructuring plans. We cannot have you tracking mud and noise through the halls. Focus on your field chores and leave the residential management to us." The stakes increased significantly when I discovered that Julian had already moved his entire architectural staff into Grandpa's historic great room. I walked past the low valley windows on Friday evening and saw them setting up long rows of white plastic tables, covering Grandpa's hand-carved oak furniture with blue commercial blueprints and digital rendering monitors. They were mapping out the property like a conquered territory. A few days later, I found a discarded commercial brochure in the residential trash bin. It was a formal pitch deck created by Julian's firm, titled The Thorne Luxury Terraces, a minimalist, high-density reimagining of a historical Vermont estate. They weren't just planning to live in the house, they were planning to completely demolish the historic stonework, log the 12 acres of old-growth timber, and build an ugly concrete complex of luxury holiday condos for out-of-state tourists. "You cannot do this," I screamed at my father, confronting him in the driveway as he arrived home from a meeting with the local planning board. "Your grandfather was an old-fashioned man who died with a broken mind, Owen," my father said, his voice completely flat as he slid his luxury leather briefcase out of his car. "Sentimentality doesn't pay the property taxes on an estate of this size. Julian's firm is on the hook for a massive commercial debt in the city. Selling this land to his developers is the only way to protect our family's financial survival. The local zoning board has already fast-tracked our variance application. The demolition crews are scheduled for the first week of January." I felt an overwhelming wave of absolute terror. I was completely outmatched, trapped by my own lack of corporate authority and facing a legal team hired by my parents to ensure I stayed completely powerless in the caretaker's cottage while they destroyed my grandfather's life's work.
The turning point occurred late last night, just 24 hours before the fateful Christmas Eve gathering. The entire estate was buried under a massive, howling winter storm that drifted snow up against the cottage windows. I couldn't sleep. My grandfather's final, desperate words kept echoing through my mind over and over again like a structural alarm bell. The safe, under the desk, the baseboard, don't let Evelyn see. I knew I had to act. I waited until 2 o'clock in the morning, when the main house was completely dark and the private security guard was asleep in his heated vehicle near the front gate. Moving like a shadow through the sub-zero wind, I walked across the frozen lawn, carrying nothing but a small headlamp and my grandfather's old iron crowbar. I entered the mansion through the old coal chute in the cellar floor, a hidden entryway Grandpa and I had reinforced 10 years ago that my mother had completely forgotten existed. I crept up the back maid's staircase, my boots held in my hand, my heart hammering violently against my chest as I reached the dark library. The room smelled like cold lemon polish and empty air. I knelt down in the knee-hole space beneath Grandpa's heavy mahogany desk, my fingers trembling as I searched the ornate trim of the baseboard. I pressed my thumb against a tiny hand-carved knot in the oak molding. Click. A 5-foot section of the baseboard cleanly slid outward on a pair of hidden brass tracks. Behind it sat a heavy, industrial-grade iron floor safe, painted a deep forest green. My breath hitched. The combination lock was an old mechanical dial. I closed my eyes and thought of Grandpa Silas.
He was a man who used the same numbers for everything, the coordinates of the first stone quarry he ever owned, 321488. I turned the dial, the heavy internal tumblers dropping with a loud metallic clunk that sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. I pulled the heavy iron door open. Inside, sitting on a velvet shelf, was a thick, moisture-sealed leather folio. I opened it under the dim beam of my headlamp, and the reality of what I was holding made me drop to my knees on the hardwood floor. It wasn't a duplicate will or a stash of money. It was an ironclad, certified deed of conditional trust and conservation easement dated exactly 3 weeks before Grandpa Silas was admitted to hospice. I read the legal pages, my eyes scanning the official stamps, as a profound, freezing clarity washed over me. The Silas Thorne Homestead Preservation Trust. Be it known that the primary title of the property known as the Thorne Estate is hereby transferred exclusively to Owen Silas Thorne as sole managing trustee. The executors, Evelyn and Arthur Thorne, are granted a temporary life estate interest only, which is strictly conditional upon the total preservation of the historic residential structures and the surrounding timberlands. Any attempt to alter, demolish, subdivide, or leverage the primary real estate for commercial development shall result in the immediate, automatic forfeiture of all executor permissions and the total, permanent eviction of the violating parties from the property. I turned to the final page. There it was, my grandfather's heavy, shaky signature, written with a fountain pen, sitting directly underneath a certified notary stamp from the state of Vermont. But right next to his name was another signature that made my jaw drop. Mr. Abernathy, Elder Counsel. Grandpa Silas hadn't lost his mind. He had seen the greed growing in my mother's eyes for years, and he had quietly orchestrated a legal fortress to protect the land, choosing his longtime retired attorney to handle the filing in absolute secrecy. My parents thought they were transferring a clean deed to Julian tonight. They had no idea they were actually signing a document that triggered their own immediate legal eviction. I had the foundation back. I tucked the leather folio inside my insulated jacket and stepped back into the freezing night, ready for the storm.
The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a deceptive, peaceful silence. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the valley covered in a brilliant, blinding white crust of ice. The countdown clock was ticking toward the 6 p.m. family holiday dinner, and every single hour felt like a slow, high-stakes march toward a massive explosion. 10 a.m. I stood by my cottage window and watched a massive commercial delivery truck back up the driveway of the main house. Workers in heavy coats began unloading expensive catering crates, cases of premium champagne, and massive ice sculptures shaped like modern skyscrapers, Julian's ridiculous idea of holiday decor. My parents were preparing a victory celebration. They thought they were celebrating the birth of Julian's new condo project. 1 p.m. I sat at my small kitchen table reviewing the trust documents over and over again with Mr. Abernathy's junior partner, a young, brilliant property attorney named Clara Vance, whom I had contacted using a private emergency number Grandpa had left in the safe. "This is completely airtight, Owen," Clara told me over an encrypted video call, her eyes scanning the digital copies I had sent her. "The moment your parents sign any document attempting to transfer the deed to Julian's development firm, they are in direct violation of the preservation clause. The forfeiture is immediate. I have already drafted the formal cease and desist order and the emergency eviction warrant. I will have a county sheriff's deputy standing by on the main road at 6:30 p.m. to serve the papers the second you give the word." 3 p.m. I walked over to the main house under the pretense of draining the outdoor garden spigots before the hard night freeze. I found my brother Julian standing on the stone porch, smoking an expensive cigar, wearing a cashmere winter coat that cost more than my annual land surveying equipment budget.
"Ah, Owen," he called out, a smug, arrogant grin spreading across his face as he blew a cloud of gray smoke into the clean winter air. "Make sure you clear the western driveway entirely before 6. We have some incredibly high net worth investors arriving from New York tonight. And don't worry about changing into a suit for dinner. We've set up a beautiful holiday buffet table for the staff and contractors in the heated garage. We figured you'd feel more comfortable there." "I'll be in the dining room at 6, Owen," I said, my voice entirely flat, as I turned the brass valve on the spigot. He chuckled softly, tapping the ash from his cigar onto Grandpa's hand-carved stone steps. "Don't be difficult, Owen. Tonight is a major transitional event for this family. Don't ruin it with your usual resentful attitude. Learn to accept that things change." 5:30 p.m. I stood in my cottage bedroom, my hands freezing as I fastened the cuffs of my grandfather's old flannel shirt under my formal tweed jacket. The internal emotional struggle was a heavy, suffocating weight. These were my parents. This was my brother. Part of me, the lonely child who had spent decades wishing my mother would look at me with the same pride she reserved for Julian, wanted to just drop the folio in the snow, get in my truck, and drive away from Vermont forever, leaving them to ruin themselves. But then I looked down at my hands. They were covered in the same tiny white scars from mortar mixing that Grandpa Silas had carried. I thought of the stones he had pulled from the riverbed. I thought of his final, desperate whisper in that sterile hospice room. "You protect the stones, Owen." If I stayed silent tonight out of fear or a false sense of family peace, the villains would win, and my grandfather's life would be erased from the earth by a fleet of bulldozers. I took the leather folio, placed it flat inside my brief bag, and walked toward the brilliant lights of the mansion. The holiday countdown was officially at 0.
The grand dining room of the Thorne Mansion was a display of pure, unadulterated vanity. The massive fieldstone fireplace was roaring, but its warmth was completely canceled out by the sterile, high society guests filling the space. 25 people, wealthy city developers, local politicians, and country club board members stood around the long mahogany table drinking vintage champagne and laughing loudly under the heavy brass chandeliers. My mother sat at the absolute head of the table, looking like a queen in a striking silver holiday dress. Julian stood directly to her right, holding a leather folder containing the new property deed, surrounded by 3 wealthy New York investors who were checking their gold watches. I walked into the room and took a standalone chair near the corner of the parlor doors, completely ignored by the glittering crowd. As the catering staff began pouring the final round of champagne, my mother stood up and tapped her crystal glass with a heavy silver spoon, bringing the entire ballroom to an immediate, expectant silence. "Friends, family, and distinguished partners," she began, her voice carrying a perfectly practiced aristocratic warmth that made my skin crawl. "Welcome to the Thorne Estate. Tonight, on this beautiful Christmas Eve, we aren't just celebrating the holidays, we are celebrating a magnificent transformation. As the primary executors of my late father's estate, Arthur and I have officially signed the deed transfer, passing this historic property over to Julian's premier firm, Thorne Modern Developments." The room erupted into polite applause and cheers. Julian bowed deeply, his face glowing with pure, unmitigated arrogance. "This land," Julian announced, stepping up to the podium my mother had set up near the fireplace, "will soon be home to the most exclusive luxury terrace complex in the state. We begin logging the old-growth timber next week, and the demolition of these outdated structures will commence immediately after the new year. We are turning sentimentality into true capital." "You aren't logging a single tree, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the applause with a cooled, absolute clarity that instantly stopped the noise in the room. The guests turned in a synchronized wave of shocked confusion, their eyes locking onto me as I stood up from my chair in the corner.
My mother's smile instantly froze into a hard, dangerous line that vibrated across the long table. "Owen, you are entirely out of line. Security is outside. Leave this dining room immediately and go back to your quarters before I have you permanently removed from this property." "I told you to be a team player, Owen," my father shouted from the side, his face flushing a deep, angry red as he stepped toward me. "You don't own this house. We are the executors. The legal deed belongs to Julian now." "No, Dad, it doesn't," I said, walking slowly toward the center of the mahogany table, my boots making a solid, definitive thud against the hard wood. I opened my brief bag and dropped the thick leather folio directly into the center of my mother's silver holiday centerpiece, knocking over a crystal vase of white roses. "You three spent the last 2 years thinking Grandpa Silas died with a broken mind. You thought because you managed the basic tax files, you had the right to destroy his legacy. You never actually checked the hidden safe." My mother looked down at the old leather folio, her hands visibly tensing as she refused to touch it. "This is an absolute farce. Arthur, call the sheriff's office. He's trespassing and disrupting a private corporate event." "Go ahead and call the sheriff, Mom," I said, leaning my hands flat against the mahogany table, looking directly into her calculating blue eyes. "In fact, you don't have to. I've already called them. Clara Vance and a county deputy are standing at the end of the driveway right now, waiting for me to give the word." Uncle Richard, who was sitting near the center of the table, reached out and pulled the document sheets out of the leather cover. He adjusted his reading spectacles, his eyes scanning the official state seals and the prominent notary signature at the bottom of the page. "My God, Evelyn," Richard whispered, his voice cracking as he looked up at his sister with a face filled with absolute, genuine horror. "This isn't a draft. This is a certified preservation trust filed by Silas 3 weeks before he passed away. It's completely legal. It's registered." "What are you talking about?" Julian shouted, tearing the papers out of Richard's hands, his face twisting into a mask of pure, desperate panic as his eyes raced across the legal lines. "This is impossible. I reviewed the county property index myself last month. There was no trust listed under the primary family name." "That's because Grandpa Silas didn't file it under the family name, Julian," I said, turning my gaze to my brother, whose hands were now shaking so hard the paper was rattling against his coat. "He filed it under an independent agricultural landholding company that he owned since 1974, a company you never bothered to research because you were too busy drawing luxury condos on paper. And look at the forfeiture clause on page 4. Clara Vance walked through the front door of the parlor at that exact second, wearing a sharp winter trench coat holding a stack of certified legal warrants. As counsel for the sole trustee, Owen Thorne, Clara announced to the entire silent room of investors, "I am serving notice to all present parties, Evelyn and Arthur Thorne, by signing a commercial deed transfer to a development firm tonight, you have officially triggered the automatic forfeiture clause of the Silas Thorne Homestead Trust. Your executor permissions are permanently revoked as of 6:14 p.m. tonight." "This is my house," my mother screamed, her voice reaching an unhinged, hysterical pitch as she slammed her champagne glass onto the table, shattering the crystal base. "I am his daughter. You cannot push me out of my own father's home." "Actually, Mrs. Thorne, we can," Clara Vance replied, handing a signed court document directly to my father. "Under the preservation emergency terms, your life estate interest is completely void due to active property endangerment. You, your husband, and Julian Thorne have exactly 2 hours to pack your personal items and vacate the residential structures. A county deputy is waiting on the porch to escort you off the property." the silence that fell over the grand dining room was completely absolute. The New York investors looked at the spreadsheet entries, looked at Julian's sweating, pale face, and immediately began picking up their coats and briefcases, walking out the side doors without saying a single word. They didn't want to be anywhere near a multi-million-dollar family fraud eviction. My mother collapsed back into her chair, her expensive silver dress looking completely ridiculous against the background of the fieldstone fireplace, her eyes staring at the white roses scattered across the table in a state of absolute, definitive defeat.
The legal and social fallout from that Christmas Eve confrontation was swift, absolute, and completely merciless. Because the Preservation Trust was entirely ironclad and backed by the impeccable reputation of Mr. Abernathy's firm, my parents' legal defense team couldn't find a single loophole to challenge. Within 48 hours, the court issued a permanent injunction against Thorne Modern Developments, completely freezing Julian's access to any family assets. Without the $1.8 million Thorne estate to use as collateral for his commercial credit lines, Julian's architectural firm collapsed into immediate bankruptcy by the second week of January. His high-end city penthouse was repossessed by the lenders, and his affluent metropolitan partners completely abandoned him the moment the story of his predatory family scheme was published in the state's legal journal. He was forced to take a low-level position as a commercial draftsman for a standard construction firm in another state, completely cut off from the luxury legacy he had done nothing to protect. My parents, Evelyn and Arthur, faced total social ruin within their wealthy country club circle. The news that they had been legally evicted from their own father's historic homestead on Christmas Eve for trying to illegally demolish a historic landmark spread through the community like wildfire. They were forced to move into a small, rented two-bedroom condo on the edge of the county, their lifestyle completely restricted to living off my father's modest personal retirement stipend. My mother refused to answer my phone calls, completely trapped in her own bitter resentment. Socially, the family dynamics were entirely rewritten. I assumed my official role as sole managing trustee of the estate, moving my belongings from the caretaker's cottage back into the main residence. My first official act on Monday morning was to hire a local historical restoration crew to dismantle the white plastic tables and modern commercial cables Julian had tracked into the great room. The house quickly returned to its true form. I reopened Grandma Clara's old kitchen, throwing away the sterile synthetic lavender oils my mother had placed in the halls. By the end of the winter, the mansion smelled like seasoned white pine wood smoke, old leather books, and the deep, rich, comforting aroma of fresh gingerbread once again. The historic fieldstone chimney was completely secure, its foundation held together by the exact promises Grandpa Silas made to the land. It is now a spectacularly beautiful evening in late spring, exactly 5 months since that freezing explosion on Christmas Eve. The heavy winter snows have completely melted from the valley, replaced by a brilliant, vibrant carpet of green grass and wild mountain lupines blooming across the 12 acres of timberland. I am sitting on the wide stone porch of the main house, holding an old ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the golden sun set behind the distant green mountains. The air is warm and clean, carrying the crisp, sharp scent of fresh pine sap from the northern woods. I feel an incredible, deep sense of emotional calm. The reflection I see in the dark glass of the library window isn't the insecure, hurt son who spent decades begging for a cold mother's love and validation. It's the face of a man who knows his exact worth, his true identity, and his sacred responsibility to the past. I realized that my family's ultimate betrayal on that holiday night was actually the greatest gift they could have ever given me. By pushing me to the absolute brink of despair, they forced me to dig into the hidden foundation of this home and discover the true depth of my grandfather's love and trust in me. I am not a second-class citizen in this family. I am the true keeper of the Thorne Foundation.
I've grown immensely over the past few months. The burning anger and resentment I carried for years against Evelyn, Arthur, and Julian have completely dissolved, replaced by a profound sense of quiet pity. They spent their entire lives chasing the empty shadow of social status and corporate capital, entirely blind to the fact that the only real wealth in this world is honesty, loyalty, and a deep connection to the earth beneath your feet. The story concludes not with a dramatic declaration, but with a peaceful, silent dusk. I walk down the stone steps of the porch and head toward the western fence line, my work boots sinking into the solid, damp Vermont soil. I stop by the massive stone chimney structure at the edge of the old barn layout, placing my hand against the rough, hand-cut field stone Grandpa Silas pulled from the riverbed so many decades ago. The roots go deep here. The winter storm blew as hard as it possibly could, but the foundation didn't crack, and neither did I. A real home isn't an asset on a corporate balance sheet, and a family legacy isn't determined by who has the slickest charm or the most expensive clothes. It's built out of the quiet promises we keep, the hard work we put into the soil, and the absolute truth that will always find its way out of the darkness, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it under a mountain of lies. I want to ask you a very personal question. Have you ever had a family member or someone you trusted try to push you out of your rightful place or take credit for your hard work? Have you ever discovered a secret that completely shifted the balance of power in your own life and gave you the courage to finally stand up for your true value? How did you find the strength to protect your own foundation when the people around you were trying to demolish it? Please share your thoughts, your personal journeys, and your own magnificent stories of resilience in the comments below. I read through every single one of them, and your individual survival stories are what keep this community so incredibly vibrant and strong. If you found inspiration or a profound sense of justice tonight in Owen's ultimate victory over greed and deception, please hit that like button. It significantly helps our videos reach other quiet workers who might be standing in a cold room right now, needing the strength to fight for their own heritage. Don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell so you never miss another long-form story of family betrayal, financial justice, and ultimate emotional closure. Keep your foundations true and remember who built your stones. Thank you for watching and stay strong out there.